Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead, back with you to read the next chapter in our book, Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So this chapter is called Keeping House, and here's the picture they have. Uncle Andrew lived 10 miles away. For a week, Father and Mother were getting ready to go, and all the time they were thinking of things that must be done while they were away. Even when Mother was climbing into the buggy, she was still talking. Be sure to gather the eggs every night, she said. And I depend on you, Elijah Jane, to take care of the churning. Don't salt the butter too much. Pack it in a small tub and be sure to cover it. Remember not to pick the beans and peas I'm saving for seed. Now, you all be good while I'm gone. She was tucking her hoops down between the seat and dashboard. Father spread the lap robe. And mind, Elijah Jane, be careful with the fires. Don't you leave the house while there's a fire in the cook stove. And don't you get scuffling with lighted candles, whatever you do. And Father tightened the reins and the horses started. Don't eat all the sugar, Mother called back. The buggy turned into the road. The horses began to trot, rapidly taking Father and Mother away. In a little while, the sound of the buggy wheels ceased. Father and Mother were gone. Nobody said anything. Even Elijah Jane looked a little scared. The house and the barns and the fields seemed big and empty. For a whole week, Father and Mother would be 10 miles away. Suddenly, Almanzo threw his hat into the air and yelled. Alice hugged herself and cried, "What do we do first?" They could do anything they liked. There was nobody to stop them. We'll do the dishes and make the beds, Elijah Jane said, bossy. Let's make ice cream, Royal shouted. Elijah Jane loved ice cream. She hesitated and said, well... Almanzo ran after Royal to the ice house. They dug a block of ice out of the sawdust and put it in a grain sack. They laid the sack on the back porch and pounded it with hatchets until the ice was crushed. Alice came out to watch them while she whipped egg whites on a platter. She beat them with a fork till they were too stiff to slip when she tilted the platter. Elijah Jane measured milk and cream and dipped the sugar from the barrel in the pantry. It was not common maple sugar, but white sugar bought from the store. Mother used it only when company came. Elijah Jane dipped 6 cupfuls. Then she smoothed the sugar that was left. You could hardly tell that any was missing. She made a big milk pool filled of yellow custard. They set the pail in a tub and packed the snowy crushed ice around it with salt, and they covered it all with a blanket. Every few minutes they took off the blanket, uncovered the pail, and stirred the freezing ice cream. When it was frozen, Alice brought saucers and spoons, and Almanzo brought out a cake and a butcher knife. He cut enormous pieces of cake, while Elijah Jane heaped the saucers. They could eat all the ice cream and cake they wanted to. No one would stop them. At noon, they'd eaten the whole cake and almost all the ice cream. Elijah Jane said it was time to get dinner, but the others didn't want any dinner. Almanzo said, all I want is watermelon. Alice jumped up. Goody, let's go get one. Alice, Elijah Jane cried, you come right back here and do the breakfast dishes. I will, Alice called out, when I get back. Alice and Almanzo went into the hot melon field where the melons lay round above the wilting flat leaves. Almanzo snapped his finger against the green rinds and he listened. When a melon sounded ripe, it was ripe. And when it sounded green, it was green. But when Almanzo said a melon sounded ripe, Alice thought it sounded green. There wasn't really any way to know, though Almanzo was sure that he knew more about melons than any old girl. So in the end, they picked 6 of the biggest melons. They lugged them one by one to the ice house and put them on the cold, damp sawdust. Then Alice went into the house to do the dishes. Almanzo said he wasn't going to do anything. Maybe he'd go swimming. But as soon as Alice was out of sight, he skipped through the barns and stole into the pasture where the colts were. The pasture was big and the sun was very hot. The air shimmered and wavered in the heat, and little insects made shrill sounds. Bess and Beauty were lying down in the shade of the tree, and their little colts were near them, wagging their small bushy tails and straddling a little on their long gangly legs. The yearlings and the 2-year-olds and the 3-year-olds were grazing. All of them lifted their heads and stared at Almanzo. He went slowly toward them, holding out his hand. There wasn't anything in his hand, but they didn't know that. He didn't mean to do anything. He only wanted to be near enough to pet them. Starlight and the other little colt ran wobbling to their mothers, and Bess and Beauty lifted up their heads and looked, then laid them back down again. The big colts pricked up their ears. One big colt stepped towards Almanzo, then another. The 6 big colts were all coming. Almanzo wished he'd brought carrots for them. They were so beautiful and free and big, tossing their manes and showing the whites of their eyes. Sunshine glistened on their strong, arched necks and on the muscles of their chests. Suddenly, one of them said, whoosh. One of them kicked and one of them squealed, and all at once their heads went up, their tails went up, their hoofs thundered on the ground. All their brown haunches and high black tails were turned to Almanzo. Like a thundering whirlwind, those 6 colts went around the tree, and Almanzo heard them behind him. He whirled around. He saw their pounding hooves and big chests coming straight at him. They were running too fast to stop. There wasn't time to get out of the way. Almanzo shut his eyes and yelled, "Whoa!" The air and the ground shook. His eyes opened. He saw the brown knees rising up in the air, a round belly and hind legs rushed overhead. Brown sides went by him like thunder. His hat flew off. He felt stunned. One of the 3-year-olds had jumped over him. The colts were thundering down the pasture, and Almanzo saw a Royal coming. "Leave those colts be!" Royal shouted. He came up and said that for a cent he'd give Almanzo the licking that he would never forget. "You know better than to fool with those colts," Royal said. He took Almanzo by the ear. But the ear was, by the ear. Almanzo trotted, but his ear was pulled all the way to the barns. He said he hadn't done anything. Royal wouldn't listen. "Let me catch you in that pasture again, and I'll whale the hide off you," Royal said. "I'll tell Father, too." Almanzo went away rubbing his ear. He went down to Trout River and swam in the swimming hole till he felt better. But he thought it wasn't fair that he was the youngest in the family. That afternoon the melons were cold, and Almanzo carried them to the grass under the balsam tree in the yard. Royal stuck the butcher knife into the dewy green rinds, and every melon was so ripe that the rinds cracked right open. Almanzo and Alice and Elijah Jane and Royal bit deep in the juicy cold slices, and they ate till they could eat no more. Almanzo pinched the black seeds, popping them at Elijah Jane until she made him quit. Then he slowly ate the last slice of melon and said, "I'm going to fetch Lucy to eat up the rinds." "You'll do no such thing," Elijah Jane said. "The idea! Dirty old pig in the front yard." "She is not either, dirty old pig," said Almanzo. "Lucy's a clean, young pig. Pigs are the cleanest animals there are. You just ought to see the way Lucy keeps her bed clean and turns it and airs it and makes it every day. Horses won't do that, and nor cows or sheep or anything. Pigs, I guess I know that. I guess I know as much about pigs as you do, Elijah Jane said. Then don't you call Lucy dirty. She's just as clean as you be. Well, Mother told you to obey me, Elijah Jane answered. And I'm not going to waste watermelon rinds on a pig. I'm going to make watermelon rind preserves. I guess they're as much my rinds as they are yours, Amanzo began. But Royal got up and said, Come on, Manzo, it's chore time. Amanzo said no more, but when the chores were done, he let Lucy out of the pen. The little pig was as white as a lamb, and she liked Amanzo. Her little curled tail quirked whenever she saw him. She followed him to the house, grunting happily, and she squealed for him at the door till Elijah Jane said she couldn't hear herself think. After supper, Amanzo took a plate of scraps and fed them to Lucy. And this is what that looks like. That looks pretty fun. He sat on the back steps and scratched her prickly back. Pigs enjoy that. In the kitchen, Elijah Jane and Royal were arguing about candy. Royal wanted some, but Elijah said that candy pulls are only for winter evenings. Royal said he didn't see why candy wouldn't be just as good as in the summer. Monzo thought so too, and he went in and sided with Royal. Alice said she knew how to make candy. Elijah Jane wouldn't do it, but Alice mixed sugar and molasses and water and boiled them, and then she poured the candy on buttered platters and set it on the porch to cool. They rolled up their sleeves and buttered their hands, ready to pull it, and Elijah Jane's buttered her hands too. All the time Lucy was squealing for Amanzo. He went to see if the candy was cool enough, and he thought his little pig should have some. The candy was cool. No one was watching, so he took a big wad of the soft brown candy and dropped it over the edge of the porch into Lucy's wide open mouth. Then they all pulled candy. They pulled it in long strands, and then they doubled the strands and pulled it again. Every time they doubled it, they took a bite. It was very sticky, stuck to their teeth and their fingers and their faces. Somehow it got in their hair and stuck there too. It should have become hard and brittle, but it didn't. They pulled and they pulled. Still it was soft and sticky. Long time past bedtime, they gave up and went to bed. Next morning, when Amanzo started to do chores, Lucy was standing in the yard. Her tail hung limp and her head hung down. She did not squeal when she saw him. She shook her head sadly and wrinkled her nose. Where her white teeth should have been, there was a smooth brown streak. Lucy's teeth were stuck together with candy. She could not eat. She couldn't even drink. She couldn't even squeal. She could not grunt. But when she saw Amanzo coming, she ran. Amanzo yelled for Royal. They chased Lucy all around the house, under the snowball bushes and the lilacs. They chased her all over the garden. Lucy whirled and dodged and ducked and ran just like anything. All the time she didn't make a sound. She couldn't. Her mouth was full of candy. She ran between Royal's legs and upset him. That means tipped him over. Amanzo almost grabbed her and went sprawling on his nose. She tore through the peas and squashed the ripe tomatoes and uprooted green round cabbages. Elijah Jane kept calling Royal and Amanzo to catch her. Alice ran after her. At last they cornered her. She dashed around Alice's skirts. Amanzo fell on her and grabbed. She kicked and tore a big hole down the front of his blouse. They called it a blouse then instead of a shirt. Almanzo held her down. Alice kept her kicking hind legs. Royal pried open her mouth and scraped out the candy. Then how Lucy squealed. She squealed all the squeals that she had not been able to all night, and all the squeals she couldn't squeal when they were chasing her, and she ran screaming to her pen. Almanzo James Wilder, just look at yourself, Elijah Jane scolded. He couldn't. He didn't want to. Even Alice was horrified because he had wasted candy on a pig, and his blouse was ruined. Could be patched, but the patch would show. I don't care, Almanzo said. He was glad it was a whole week before Mother would know. That day they made ice cream again, and they ate the last cake. Alice said she knew how to make a pound cake. She'd made one, and she would make one, and then she was going to sit in the parlor. That's a room that nobody went in unless they had company. Almanzo thought that wouldn't be any fun, but Elijah Jane said, "You'll do no such thing, Alice. You know very well the parlor's just for company." It was not Elijah Jane's parlor, and Mother hadn't said she couldn't sit in it. Almanzo thought that Alice could sit in the parlor if she wanted to. That afternoon he came into the kitchen to see if the pound cake was done. Alice was taking it out of the oven. It smelled so good that he broke a little piece off the corner. Then Alice cut a slice to hide the broken place. And then they ate 2 more slices with the last of the ice cream. "I can make more ice cream," Alice said. Elijah Jane was upstairs, and Almanzo said, "Let's go into the parlor." They tiptoed in without making a sound. The light was dim because the blinds were down, but the parlor was beautiful. The wallpaper was white and gold, and the carpet was of Mother's best weaving, almost too fine to step on. The center table was marble-topped, and it held a tall parlor lamp, all white and gold china and pink-painted roses. Beside it laid a photograph album with covers of red velvet and mother of pearl. All around the walls stood solemn horsehair chairs, and George Washington's picture looked sternly from its frame between the windows. Alice hitched up her hoops behind and sat on the sofa. The slippery haircloth slid her right off onto the floor. She didn't dare laugh out loud for fear that Elijah Jane would hear. She sat on the sofa again and slid off again. Then Almanzo slid off a chair. When company came, they had to sit in the parlor. They kept themselves on the slippery chairs by pushing their toes against the floor, but now they could let go and slide. They slid off the sofa and the chairs till Alice was giggling so hard she didn't dare slide any more. Then they looked at the shells and the coral and the little china figures on the whatnot. That'd be a shelf. They didn't touch anything. They looked till they heard Elijah Jane coming downstairs. Then they tiptoed out of the parlor and shut the door without a sound. Elijah Jane didn't catch them. It seemed that a week would last forever, but suddenly it was gone. One morning at breakfast, Elijah Jane said, "Father and Mother will be here tomorrow." They all stopped eating. The garden had not been weeded, the peas and beans had not been picked, so the vines were ripening too soon. The hen house had not been whitewashed. "This house is a sight," Elijah Jane said, "and we must churn today. But what am I going to tell Mother? The sugar's all gone." Nobody ate any more. They looked into the sugar barrel, and they could see the bottom of it. Only Alice tried to be cheerful. "We must hope for the best," she said, like Mother. "There's some sugar left. Mother said don't eat all the sugar, and we didn't. There's some around the edges." This was only the beginning of that awful day. They went to work as hard as they could. Royal and Almanzo hoed the garden. They whitewashed the hen house. They cleaned the cow stalls, and they swept the south barn floor. The girls were sweeping and scrubbing the house. Elijah Jane made Almanzo churn till the butter came, and then her hands flew while she washed and salted it and packed it in a tub. There was only bread and butter and jam for dinner, though Almanzo was starved. Now, Almanzo, you polish the heater, Elijah Jane said. He hated to polish stoves, but he hoped Elijah Jane would not tell that he'd wasted the candy on his pig. He went to work with the stove blackening and the brush. Elijah Jane was hurrying and nagging. Be careful you don't spill the polish, she said, busily dusting. Almanzo guessed he knew enough not to spill stove polish, but he didn't say anything. Use less water, Almanzo. And mercy, rub harder than that. He didn't say anything. Elijah Jane went into the parlor to dust it. She called, Almanzo, that stove be done now? No, said Almanzo. Goodness, don't dwaddle so. Almanzo muttered, whose boss are you? Elijah Jane asked, what did you say? Nothing, Almanzo said. Elijah Jane came to the door. You did so say something. Almanzo straightened up and shouted, I said, whose boss are you? Elijah Jane gasped. Then she cried, you just wait, Almanzo James Wilder. You just wait till I tell Mother. Almanzo didn't mean to throw the blackening brush. It flew right out of his hand. It sailed past Elijah Jane's head, smack. It hit the parlor wall. A great smash and smear of blackening appeared on the white and gold wallpaper. Alice screamed, Almanzo turned around and ran all the way to the barn. He crawled into the haymow and far back into the hay. He did not cry, but he would have cried if he wasn't almost 10 years old. Mother would come home and find he had ruined her beautiful parlor. Father would take him to the woodshed and whip him with the black snake whip. He didn't ever want to come out of the haymow. He wished he could stay there forever. After a long while, Royal came into the haymow and called him. He crawled out of the hay, and he saw that Royal knew. Manny, you're going to get an awful whipping, Royal said. Royal was sorry, but he couldn't do anything. They both knew Almanzo deserved a whipping, and there was no way to keep Father from knowing it, so Almanzo said, I don't care. He helped do the chores and he ate supper. He wasn't hungry, but to show Elijah Jane he didn't care. Then he went to bed. The parlor door was shut, but he knew how the black splotch looked on the gold and white wall. Next day, Father and Mother came driving into the yard. Almanzo had to go out to meet them with the others. Alice whispered to him, don't feel bad. Maybe they won't care. But she looked anxious too. Father said cheerfully, well, here we are. Been getting along all right? Yes, Father, Royal answered. Almanzo didn't go to unhitch the driving horses. He stayed in the house. Mother hurried about, looking at everything, while she untied her bonnet strings. I declare, Elijah Jane and Alice, she said, you've kept the house as well as I would have done myself. Mother, Alice said in a small voice. Mother? Well, child, what is it? Mother, Alice said, you told us not to eat all the sugar. Mother, we ate almost all of it. Mother laughed. You've been so good, she said. I won't scold you about the sugar. She did not know that the black splotch was on the parlor wall. The parlor door was shut. She did not know it that day nor the next. Almanzo could hardly choke down his food. At meal times, and Mother looked worried. She took him to the pantry and made him swallow a big spoonful of horrible black medicine made of roots and herbs. He did not want her to know about the black splotch, and yet he wished she did know. When the worst was over, he could stop dreading it. The second evening, they heard a buggy driving into the yard. Mr. and Mrs. Webb were in it. Father and Mother went out to meet them, and in a minute they all came into the dining room. Almanzo heard Mother saying, "Come right into the parlor." He couldn't move. He could not even speak. This was worse than anything he had thought of. Mother was so proud of her beautiful parlor. She was so proud of always keeping it nice. She didn't know that he had ruined it, and now she was taking company in. They would see the big black splotch on the wall. Mother opened the parlor door and went in. Mrs. Webb went in, and Mr. Webb and Father. Almanzo saw only their backs, but he heard the window shades go up. He saw that the parlor was full of light. It seemed to him a long time before anyone said anything. Then Mother said, "Take this chair, Mr. Webb, and make yourself comfortable. Sit right here on the sofa, Mrs. Webb." Almanzo couldn't believe his ears. Mrs. Webb said, "You have such a beautiful parlor. I declare it's almost too fine to sit in." Now Almanzo could see where the blacking brush had hit the wall, and he could not believe his eyes. The wallpaper was white and gold, pure white and gold. There was no black splotch on it. Mother caught sight of him and said, "Come in, Almanzo." He went in. He sat straight in his hair on a hair cloth chair and pushed his toes against the floor to keep from sliding off. Father and Mother were telling all about the visit to Uncle Andrew's. There was no black splotch anywhere on the wall. "Didn't you worry leaving the children alone here, and you so far away?" Mrs. Webb asked. "No," Mother said proudly. "I knew the children would take care of everything as well as if James and I were here." Almanzo minded his manners and did not say a word. Next day, when no one was looking, he stole into the parlor. That means he snuck in. He looked carefully at the place where the black splotch had been. The wallpaper was patched. The patch had been cut out carefully around the gold scrolls, and the pattern was fitted perfectly to the edges of the patch, scraped so thin that he could hardly find them. He waited until he could speak to Elijah Jane alone, and then he asked, "Elijah Jane, did you patch the wallpaper for me?" "Yes," she said. "I got the scraps of wallpaper that were saved in the attic and cut out the patch and put it on with flour paste." Almanzo said gruffly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I threw that brush at you. Honest, I didn't mean to, Elijah Jane." "I guess I was aggravating," she said, "but I didn't mean to be that either. You're the only little brother I've got." Almanzo had never before known how much he liked Elijah Jane. They never told about the black spotch on the parlor wall, and Mother never knew. Well, that was really very sweet of Elijah Jane to do. And I'm sure that it made Almanzo and her even closer. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house, out of your house, in the day and the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming.